Thank you for the warm welcome and for all the previous speakers and performers. Lisa, that was so beautiful, that violin playing. It reminds me of the story of this classical music concert featuring violinists, and there's two pickpocketers working in the audience. This is the Hasidic story from Eastern Europe, so it's appropriate to retell here. And all of a sudden, one of the pickpocketers stops, and he's looking at the violinist, and he's so amazed by their virtuosity, he looks at his friend, and his friend says, "What are you doing? We're working, we're pickpocketing." He says, "I'm just looking at that violinist, the way her fingers are going up and down the fretboard, and I'm saying to myself, what a waste, she could have been such a great pickpocketer." You chose the right career. Thank you. So I'm just going to take my iPhone out to make sure I don't go over time. Last time I was speaking, I went up for so long that virtually everybody left the audience, except for one person sitting in the front row, and I thanked him for staying. He said, "I have no choice, I'm the next speaker." So I'll try to stick to the originally scheduled time here. So before I begin my formal remarks, I'm wearing a pin. Somebody asked me what this was. This is the St. Louis pin. This is a pin that was given out a few months ago in Ottawa when our country apologized for its abysmal record during the Second World War, during the None is Too Many era. And of course, you all know that the St. Louis was turned away. The last government to turn it away was Canada. The ship was sent back to Europe, and many of its passengers perished during the Holocaust. And when I first read None is Too Many, it was just a shocking exposure to Canadian history that I was totally unfamiliar with. We know from the book that the person who designed the Canadian flag, George Stanley, was not in favor of accepting Jewish refugees. His words were, "Charity begins at home." We know our Minister of Immigration said that Jews trying to get into Canada reminded him of hogs on his father's farm, all starting to stick their nose into the trough at the same time. That's what our Minister of Immigration said. And of course, when the war was over, when the extent of the tragedy that was visited upon the Jews of Europe was known, and a senior Canadian immigration official was asked, "So now, how many Jews do you want to take in now?" Of course, his answer was, an infamous answer was, "None is too many." And I have to say 2 points. The first thing is when I read that book for the first time in the early 1980s when I was a student at York University, I was never more ashamed to be a Canadian because no one knew that. This was new history that Hesh Troper and Irving Abella revealed to the public. No one knew this. I was never more ashamed to be a Canadian. But when the Canadian government, led by our Prime Minister, but also the leaders of the opposition, apologized for this action, I was never prouder to be a Canadian. So it shows us that repentance is not just for individuals, it's also for governments. Let's give a big hand to our government and all of our political parties for taking this bold step. And before I begin my formal remarks, I just want to say one other thing. This is so important for us to remember. One of my students taught this to me, and she said, "I hate the expression that history repeats itself." History doesn't have to repeat itself. It's not a fatalistic thing. It only repeats itself because people repeat it. We don't have to do that. And the most stark example of that was in 1979. The minister in charge of immigration at the time, Ron Atke, read an early draft of the book, None is Too Many. An early draft of the book before it was actually published. And he too was shocked by the Canadian record towards Jews during the Holocaust. And then he opened up the newspapers. And what was happening in the late 1970s, anybody remember? What crisis was happening? It was the... well, FLQ is a different crisis. I'm talking about an international crisis. It was the boat people. Hundreds and thousands of boat people were being attacked and raped and pillaged and murdered in that part of the world, and nobody was opening their doors. And Ron Atke says, "I will not be the F.C. Blair of the 70s and 80s. And Canada was one of the countries in the world that let in more refugees per capita than almost any other country in the world because he learned from the mistakes of history. So as tragic as history may be, we can turn, we can change. And that student taught me, as she taught me, history does not have to repeat itself. So, first of all, I just want to thank Michael and Nadia and all the leadership staff at Library Archives Canada for this incredible acquisition. And especially at this time, when the Israeli Foundation and the Claims Conference just released a report, and I'll quote from it briefly, where they showed that over 1/5 of millennials are not sure they've heard about the Holocaust. More than half of Canadians and 2/3 of millennials did not know that 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. And 50% of all Canadians, including millennials, could not name a single Nazi camp, including Auschwitz, or a single Nazi ghetto. And let me give you some numbers. If I give you these numbers, 102, 52, 39, 96, 88, 232, and 3316. What do those numbers represent? They represent the populations of those towns that Michael referenced earlier. 102 Jews lived in Victoria in 1931, 52 in Trois-Rivières, 39 in Hull, 96 in Moose Jaw, 88 in Sault Ste. Marie, 232 in Kingston, and over 3,000 in Ottawa. And this collection of statistics just shows you how obsessed Nazi Germany was with the murder of Jews. And it's hard to understand this and even absorb the extent of the evil, the extent of the fanaticism that Nazi Germany invested in the murder of the Jews. So let me just give you one example, which to this day still shocks me to the core. There's a woman in Montreal, her name is Gina Reutemann, and when she was born, and many years later, her mother used to tell her that I saved your life in the manner in which I had you born. Because instead of having her birth, her delivery take place in the DP camp where they were interned after the war, she went to the town hospital in Passau. So not the DP camp itself, but the nearby hospital. Because something was happening in that DP camp. Children were dying mysteriously, infants. She wasn't sure what her mother was talking about. Maybe her mother was imagining it. I mean, the Holocaust took a toll on people. And a number of years ago, she went back to Germany. You know what she found out? That in that DP camp, in 46 and 47, an inordinate number of Jewish infants were dying. You know why they were dying? Because a German midwife, a German nurse, strangled to death in 46 and 47. She was born in January 48. Strangled to death 52 Jewish infants until she was finally caught and prosecuted. So think of this. Here is a woman who was sworn to protect human life. 2 years after the war is over, Hitler is dead. Germany is in ruins. 60 million people have lost their lives, and this German midwife is still strangling minutes-old infants. Can you even understand that? Can you come to grips with that evil? I certainly can't. And this is a reminder that we can never be naive about the ability and the potential for human beings to do evil. And I want to share with you what I learned from Professor Yehuda Bauer in Israel, one of the world's top historians when it comes to the Holocaust, who explained to me when I was in his class, and I'm basing my explanation on what he taught me, the difference between classical anti-Semitism and Nazi anti-Semitism. Classical anti-Semitism existed for thousands of years. And it meant discrimination. It meant lack of employment. It meant pogroms. It meant all sorts of things that happened that weren't good for the Jews. And sometimes they lost their lives. But the Jews always had 3 escape routes. The escape routes were conversion, leaving the country, or simply keeping your head low enough until the pogrom or the crisis passed. These escape routes were not present during Nazi Germany's evil reign. Because classical anti-Semitism, for the most part, was based, for the most part, on ideology. You don't believe in our God. You don't practice our customs. You don't eat the same food. So there was always an escape route. But Nazi anti-Semitism added an additional ingredient to the sociological manifestations of anti-Semitism. That, of course, was the pseudoscience of blood. This idea that there's an inherent difference between Jews and everybody else. The pseudoscience of racial hierarchy. So much so that the only way to solve the Jewish problem, the only way is what? Is murder. A Jew wrote to Hitler in the 1930s, "What should I do? I'm Jewish." And Hitler said, "You should take your own life." And that's why we have to understand the difference between Nazi anti-Semitism and regular anti-Semitism is the difference between here and the moon. It was a huge leap forward, or I should say backwards, in this evil phenomenon. And now we have to understand that the Holocaust itself was also unprecedented in terms of the history of genocide. And this is again what Yehuda Bauer explained, and I'm building on his explanation. He said that the Holocaust differed from other genocides in 4 major ways. First of all, in most genocides, you kill a certain number of people.
In the Nazi genocide, the goal was to kill every single Jew regardless of their age. You could be a day-old infant, like in that story with Gina Reutemann. You could be a 105-year-old grandmother. You were slated for genocide. Never before in the history of genocide has that happened. Secondly, regardless of your geography, wherever you lived, you were slated for murder. The only solution to the Jewish problem, according to the Nazis, was the final solution. If there were Jews on Mars, they would have murdered Jews on Mars. And as this book shows, they would have murdered every single Jewish person in North America to ever reach these shores. That was unprecedented in the history of genocide. And the third aspect, he says, is the idea of the reason behind it. Most genocides take place because there's a war, a battle over resources. People want land, they want possessions, they want all sorts of things. Were the Nazis after Jewish possessions? Yeah, but that was not the main goal. Their reason for murdering the Jews was, as I said earlier, the pseudo-scientific ideology of racial superiority. Never before in the history of humanity was a genocide perpetrated for those reasons. And the fourth unique aspect of this genocide, tragically unique, was the method of its murder. The Nazis took the methods of the mass production of objects, like an assembly line for automobiles, and applied it to the wholesale slaughter of human beings. The Jews are the raw material. They went into the assembly line, and the final product was their ashes, and the byproduct was their hair and their teeth and everything else they could salvage from the Jewish victims. Never before in the history have the tools of science been used in such a horrific manner. Those are the four differences: age, geography, ideology, and the manner in which the Jews are being murdered. And that's why it's so important for us to understand the extent of the evil. Yehuda Bauer says the following: the only thing the Jews were guilty of during the period of the Holocaust was failing to imagine the unimaginable. Failing to imagine the unimaginable. So think of this. Stop a Jew in the streets of Berlin in 1932, perhaps a Jew who fought in the First World War on behalf of Germany, and say to him the following: in 10 years from now, your country will be building death camps all across Poland, Nazi-occupied Poland, for the purpose of gassing Jews and you wouldn't even finish the sentence. The person would say to you, are you crazy? The cradle of civilization? The culture that produced Goethe and Mozart, Beethoven and Schiller is going to do this? And he would be absolutely right to have said that and would have been dead wrong. As Yehuda Bauer says, the only thing the Jews were guilty of was failing to imagine the unimaginable. And I'll say this: we don't have that excuse anymore. We can no longer be naive. And we have to understand that right now, as we are sitting here in Ottawa, in our beautiful country, democratic country called Canada, there are people planning things so evil that we can't even imagine it. That's one of the lessons of the Holocaust. Now, to end here, I think you'd all go home pretty depressed. So now I'm going to switch gears and give you the flip side of the Holocaust, the flip side of the Second World War, which hopefully will leave you with a measure of optimism. And this is the side of the people who resisted Nazi tyranny. This is the side of the people who stood up against the injustice in ways that are almost as shocking, perhaps even more shocking than the brutality I just referenced. So I'm going to tell you some stories, mostly about the righteous among the nations who saved Jewish life during the Holocaust. And why am I going to do that? First of all, because it happened. It's part of the historical record. Secondly, because these righteous people deserve to be honored. Thirdly, because in some way, some small way in our own lives, we need to emulate their behavior and stand up against injustice. And fourthly, when we teach young people on the March to Living or any Holocaust education program, we don't want to create a generation of misanthropes. We want people to understand there's also goodness in humanity. Because if the righteous didn't exist, we should just leave this planet. So these are the reasons why I want to share with you a few stories. So let me start with the following story. A woman gets on a train in France. It's during the war. And she begins to tremble because this train comes to a stop. The Nazis stop the train, and the man sitting next to her says, "What are you trembling for?" She figures she has nothing to lose. She says, "I'm Jewish. I don't have any papers." The Nazis catch me, and the life is over. The moment that happens, the Nazi kicks open the door to the train. "Where are your papers?" The man starts to yell at the woman. "You stupid, foolish, ugly woman. I can't stand you." Oh my gosh, why did I trust this man? The Nazi comes over. What are you screaming and yelling about? I'll tell you what I'm screaming and yelling about. I'm a proud citizen of this country, and here are my papers to prove it. And the stupid, foolish woman sitting next to me, do you want to know where her papers are? Where's her glasses? Where's her purse? Where's her keys? Where's this? Where's that? My idiot wife forgot her papers again. Do you understand how difficult it is to live with this woman? The Nazi says, sit down, I want order. Don't make a scene, sit down, she'll remember next time, sit down. The man sits down. The Nazi gets off the train. The next station, he gets off, she never even finds out his name. But in a split second, not only the moral courage, but the moral imagination to save her life. What a beautiful story. And I often tell people, when you see a spouse yelling at their spouse, maybe they're saving their lives. Don't jump to conclusions. But the point is that this woman did not even have, this man did not even have to think what the right thing to do. He was instinctively knew this is what he needs to do to save this person's life. What a high level of moral courage. And I got to tell you, there's so many stories like this. I mean, I have thousands, almost exactly the same story. This girl in the Chernovitz ghetto, she's 8 years old, and she smuggles herself out every single day to get food for her family because she didn't look Jewish, and because she was able to get through the crevices and bring food back for her family. And one day a Nazi catches her, doesn't realize she's Jewish, but there's an 8-year-old girl wandering around. And he says, where do you live? I have to take you home. No, I have to take you home. She can't show him where she lives, because he'll realize she's smuggling herself out of the ghetto into the area inside. She points to a home which is just a couple of blocks away from the ghetto. Well, I live there. Happened to be home of a famous opera singer. He takes her there. They climb the steps together. Knocks on the door. There's no answer. Whew. She's about to be rescued, relieved, because there's nobody home, and all of a sudden the door opens. There's the opera singer standing there. There's this little girl, and there's a Nazi, and the opera singer has no idea what these people are, and she's about to say, what do you want? But luckily, the Nazi says, I found your daughter running around the streets of Chernovitz. Is there any way to take care of your daughter? Split second, the opera singer takes her hand, smacks the girl across her face, grabs her by the scruff of the collar, throws her into the house, looks back at the Nazi, says, you have no idea the trouble my daughter causes me. Thank you for bringing her home, but I must discipline her. Have a good evening. And closes the door. Not a beautiful story? In England, there was a man by the name of Nicholas Winton. A number of years ago, his wife went into the attic, and she discovered many, many pictures of boys and girls with names and all sorts of numbers attached to them. She comes down and says, what is this? Why didn't you tell me about this? Nicholas Winton says, not everything a husband does, he shares with his wife. Anybody know what it was? It was hundreds of Jewish children. I think it was over 500, if I'm not mistaken, that he had gotten out of Europe before the Nazis closed the border. I think it was out of Czechoslovakia for the most part. He had saved hundreds of these Jewish children. Nobody even knew about it. And one of the most beautiful scenes I've ever seen in my life. She contacted the BBC. Nicholas Winton was invited into the studio. Has anybody seen this scene? Unbelievable scene. And what happens is, he's sitting there, very modest, unassuming, and the moderator says, do you know the person sitting next to you? No. And it was a woman. You saved my life, something like 7 years ago. You know the person he said, no. And the whole studio was full of all of these people whose lives he had saved, who he never sought credit for, who he had never met before, but was discovered by historical accident. Yehuda Bauer tells a story of Yoshka Indig, who smuggles hundreds of children from Europe into Italy. And he's in Italy in the town of Nantala. And the Italians are kind of turning a blind eye. But one day, the local police officer comes and says, the Germans are coming in full force. Your orphans are no longer safe. You must flee. Where can I go? I don't know. But they're not going to deal with you as kindly as we did. Luckily, he knew the local abbot. And he goes to the abbot and says, please, take my children. And the abbot says, we can take half of them, the boys. We can't take the girls. No, we can't. There's never, a woman has never even set foot in the monastery. It's not going to happen. I'm sorry. And Yoshka realized that whatever he said next would determine the fate of these girls. He says, but no, the bishop would never allow it. I'm sorry, I can't do it, he says. And he says to the abbot, for a moment, put aside what the Pope would want. Put aside what the bishop would want. Ask yourself, what your God wants. And there was a moment of silence, and then, of course, the abbot broke out in laughter and said, "You're of course right." And he saved all 200 boys and girls. Just a couple more stories before I conclude. In the town of Rokitno, eastern Poland, I believe it's now part of Ukraine now, the rabbi was hiding in the forest with his son. His son dies. He's given up hope on anything. The people in the nearby cloister, the Polish monks there, knew he was there. And every day they'd come out and sing their Polish hymns. But since the Nazis didn't speak Polish, they were singing not the regular words of the hymns, but words that said to the following effect, "Rabbi, please come out. We will save you. We will help you." Rabbi didn't know whether to trust him or not, but since his son has died, he had given up hope in life anyways. He comes out of the forest. The monks see him. They grab him. They wrestle him to the ground. They pull over one of the monk habits to make him look like a monk, and they say, "Rabbi, you're not a Christian, but you're a holy man. You're one of us. We will save you like we will save our own." And that's how this rabbi's life was saved. I heard the story from a Holocaust survivor, and I told her, there's much beautiful music in the world, but no more beautiful music when those monks were singing that song to save the rabbi's life. In a small village, in the middle of the night, a Polish couple wakes up. There's a knock on the door. There's a Jewish family pleading for assistance. The Polish farmer looks at his wife. "We can't help. We have nothing to give them. We're starving ourselves. Please, let them stay in the barn for the night." So that's what happens. They can stay for the night. The next morning they're supposed to leave. The Polish farmer comes and says, "No, we're not going to make you leave. We know what's going to happen to you if you leave. Stay as long as you need to stay." Over the next few months, they become good friends. Until one day, the Polish farmer comes by complete accident, discovers the Jewish family leaving. "Why are you leaving? We become good friends." That's the problem. We found out what happened in a neighboring Polish village. They caught a Polish family hiding a Jewish family. The penalty, of course, was death. They hung. They didn't just execute the Jews. They hung the entire Polish family, children included, with signs around their neck saying, "This is what we do to Poles who hide Jews." And the Jewish man says to the Polish farmer, "You've been so good to us. We cannot repay your goodness with evil. We're leaving." And for the first time, the Polish farmer becomes angry, looks at the Jewish man and says, "Listen to me and listen to me carefully. Put down your bags, because what happens to you happens to us. Your fate is our fate." And that is how he saved his life. Isn't that a beautiful story? So every time I do my presentation, people always complain when I leave out the story, so I must tell you this last tiny story about a woman and her child. And the last words the mother says to her child is, "You know, the Nazis are chasing us. I'm not going to survive. I hope you do, but the only way you can survive is if you outrun the Nazis. So I don't care how out of breath you are, you keep running." And so remember his mother's last words. His mother gets shot. He keeps running. And all the Nazis have given up except for one. This Nazi's hell-bent on catching the little boy. Doesn't know what to do. He's out of breath. He sees in the distance a house with a little hut next to it. He jumps into the hut as his last gasp of freedom. No sooner does he do that, he realizes he's jumped from the frying pan into the fire. Because in this small hut, connected to this farmhouse in Poland, there was a vicious dog, or vicious-looking black dog, that begins to growl at him. The dog is growling, the Nazi's closing in. Before he can make up his mind, the dog leaps past the boy and starts to bark at the Nazi so loudly, the Nazi says, "This isn't worth it," and hightails it out of there. The dog comes back into the doghouse. You can see why the kids like this story. The dog says, "Some adults do." The dog comes back into the doghouse and looks at the boy. And the boy's trembling. He doesn't know what to do. Hours pass, and the Polish farmer comes, doesn't see the boy, puts a plate of food in front of the dog. The dog doesn't eat. The boy's starving, and it's not Alpo, it's scraps on the table. And finally, after a few more hours, the boy grabs a plate, eats half, puts the other half in front of the dog, and then the dog eats. This goes on for over a month. Every day the Polish farmer comes, puts a plate of food in front of the dog, and the dog waits until the boy eats first. And I always tell people, as much as I loved my beautiful yellow Labrador to bits, he would have gloriously failed this test. I see there's a few lab owners here. So one day, the Polish farmer discovers the boy. So what does the Polish farmer do? Take him into the house or give him up to the Nazis? You see, the Polish farmer didn't know what to do either. He was too scared to take him to the house. We can understand that. But he was also not an evil person. He didn't want to give him up to the Nazis. So you know what he did? He made believe he didn't see the boy. But the boy knows he saw him. Do you know why? Because their eyes locked. You can tell when someone sees you. And secondly, the next day, the farmer brings out a second plate of food. And again, the dog does not wait and does not eat until the boy eats first. And then the cold Polish winter comes, and the boy is freezing. He's dressed in rags, and instinctively, the dog nuzzles up to him and protects him from the bitter wind. And then the spring comes, the boy is liberated. He moves to Palestine, which becomes Israel, and he writes down this story in the orphanage. It's now in the archives of Yad Vashem, Israel's National Holocaust Museum. And my professor, David Silberklein, would always finish with these last words: maybe someday the rest of humanity will rise to the level of that four-legged animal. Isn't that a beautiful story? So, my final story, I promise, reflects a quote that I learned from Dr. Naomi Azraeli. Dr. Naomi Azraeli, the head of the Azraeli Foundation that commissioned this important study, said the following: nobody survived the Holocaust, nobody, without the help of another. It could have been a slice of bread, it could have been a hiding place, it could have been a pair of shoes, it could even have been a kind look. There are people who survived because someone gave them a kind glance. You read Primo Levi, he'll tell you about that. Nobody survived the Holocaust without the help of another. And as we remember the brutality of this period, we also have to remember the nobility and the courage. And the story goes like this. This was taught to me by my teacher, Alec Geltzer. The first part of the story is Midrash. The last part is Midrash, which is Jewish imagination. The middle part is actually history in the book called Conan by Theo Richmond. In the story, the angels come to God and say, you must destroy the world. You destroyed the generation of the flood. You destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah because they're evil. Look what they're doing to your children. And God looks down and sees Sobibor and Chelmno and Majdanek and Belzec and all these evil places of destruction. And God is about to destroy the world. And of course, God sees Auschwitz-Birkenau until the following scene unfolds in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Lola Birnbaum was there for a number of months. As far as she knew, her entire family had been murdered in the Holocaust. And then she discovers her teenage son is alive in the men's camp. She goes to her Blockelster. She says to her, please, get this to my son in the other camp, please, please. And what was it? Her most precious possession, her daily ration of bread. And Elie Wiesel says, in the camp, we weren't people, we were just stomachs. That's all we thought about. We dreamed day and night about our slice of bread, our ration. And she was willing to risk her own life, and perhaps even sacrifice her own life for her own son. And does the slice of bread make it to the other side, to her son? It does. Because the next day or a few days later, the slice of bread comes back with a note from her son saying, dear mother, you need the bread just as much as I do. And Alec, my teacher, would finish the story by saying, God looked down upon the world and looked down upon Auschwitz-Birkenau and saw that slice of bread being handed for prisoner to guard, from Jew to Gentile, from female to male, all the way across from the women's camp to the men's camp and all the way back, and nobody would violate the love of a mother for her child and a child for his mother. And just then God said, you know what? There's still goodness left in the world, even in a place called Auschwitz-Birkenau. I will not destroy the world. And that story is called The Slice of Bread That Saved the World. Thank you. So, let me leave you with two quotes. Auschwitz survivor Henry Appel reminds us there's only one thing worse than Auschwitz itself, and that is if the world ever forgets there's such a place. Auschwitz will always remain as an eternal reminder of humanity's capacity for abject cruelty and evil. Roman Kent, another Holocaust survivor from Auschwitz, teaches us that hate is never right and love is never wrong. Thus, as we mark this solemn day, let us be reminded of the ever-present evils of anti-Semitism and racism. But also, let's be reminded of these incredible acts of courage and kindness that help us not give up hope in humanity. And I want to close with a poem from one of the students who came on the March of the Living. Her name is Jennifer Staffelberg. She wrote this when she was just a teenager. It's in the book called Witness, Passing the Torch of Holocaust Memory to New Generations. And this is what she wrote after her experience on the March. And as much as we teach the children and the students on the March, we learn from them. This is what she had to write. Still I cannot hate. I see bones and hair, shoes and glasses, while in a Nazi hell ruled by the devil's brother, but still I cannot hate. I see women's brushes, men's prayer shawls, and babies' tattered clothing, but still I cannot hate. I see splintered boards where people lay their weary bodies to rest. I see where people slaved and tried to exist, and still I cannot hate. I see the death and destruction, but still I cannot hate. I won't continue this tragedy. I won't fan the flames that hate like this inspires. Jennifer teaches us at the young age of 17, the best way to combat hate is not more hate, but more light. Let us all be the bringers of more light, more goodness, and more kindness, and more love to the world. Thank you all, and God bless you.